Good day, guys. Now, for today's video lecture, I'll be presenting to you a comparison between the bureaucratic structure of the Philippines and China. So, actually, this is one of our topics and as well task to compare, no, in a subject entitled Theories in Public Administration. So, this is in the graduate school. So first, just a refresher, since I have provided this slide in other video lecture, or rather in a previous video lecture entitled Introduction to Bureaucracy. So we have to define or distinguish first politics and bureaucracy. Or in this case, we identify that there are two organs of the government, which are the political organ and the administrative organ. So the political organ, in the sense, is an organ of the government which is composed of your legislative and executive. So the function of your political organ is simply to create laws and enforce the laws. So just reading it below or in the slide, the political organ is to enforce laws which are made by the legislative and policies decided by the executive. Now, there are two features of your political organ. From the term political organ, they are political in the sense they follow, or the positions within the political organ follows a political process which is called elections. So through elections, which is now reflecting a political process, or rather a power struggle, we could now see certain individuals who are struggling in order to get political positions. That is through elections, through campaigns, through voting. So that is the first political process, why it is identified as a political organ. Then the second reason why the political organ is political in nature, because your legislative and executive serves as an arena for another political process, which is now through legislation. So when we create legislation, when we look into the features of the legislative, for instance, or we could also include the executive, we now have a diversity of ideologies, of ideas, of goals. So there are a lot of members of the legislative, for the Congress, for instance, both houses. So within those diversity, when it comes to ideologies, interests, there will be clash, definitely. There will be conflict, there will be certain cooperations. So power has been used in order to lobby the interests of your legislators, of your policymakers. And it involves a political process. So for instance, those who are anti-abortion, so there will be pro-abortion. So they will be raising up their interests, their agendas, their goals, and definitely there will be clashes. So in the case of Hegel, we call it as dialectics. So upon that clash, there will now be a synthesis, a product. And that product is now through the constant battle and cooperation between members of the political organ. By the way, the diversity between the legislative and executive in democratic states practice what we call as pluralism. So pluralism, later I'll be defining it in a comparison in the Philippines, is now the diversity of interests of ideologies. We practice that one. So it tends to be political. So this is the political organ. Now, after through the process, through elections, through legislation, crafting of legislation, it will be carried out by the administrative organ of the government, which is now the bureaucracy. So the task of the bureaucracy is to carry out or administer the laws and policies that were crafted by your political organ. So for instance, we have certain Republic Acts, curfews. For instance, we have the curfew right now in the pandemic, or buildings, infrastructure. Those who will be carrying it out would now be the bureaucracy, the specialized heads or departments of the government. Excuse me. So for instance, would now be your DPWH. So the DPWH is a member of, is part of the administrative organ. The SWT, your DepEd, your PNP, they belong to the bureaucracy. So the policies that were crafted by your politicians would be administered or implemented by your departments. Now, one function, or rather one feature of your bureaucracy is they have this career service, or rather tenuity and specialization. So they probably are specialized with their certain professions, or specialized with the functions. For instance, DPWH would focus on infrastructure, the SWD on social welfare. They also enjoy this concept called tenuity. So they are field of, aside from being experts of their field, they they enjoy tenuity, so the longer on their career. And because of experience, the term there would now be experience is they are the sources of legislation. Why? One feature of your political organ, for instance, your members of the legislative, congressmen or mayors from the executive, they do not enjoy tenuity. Some of them are just new in the field, in the policy making, in the political organ. They don't have the experience. In terms of seniority, the bureaucracy contains more senior members of the government. So, young members of the legislative or the executive or new members, in order to craft policies or their basis for policies, would now be coming from the bureaucracy. So, one power of the legislative is to inquire in aid of legislation. So, when they craft certain policies, because there are certain issues, they will ask help coming from senior members of the bureaucracy. So, they will assess the situation, they will ask or ask advice in the bureaucracy, because bureaucracy also serves as policy advisors, and that will now be their basis in crafting new policies or laws. So it's a cycle. Now let us go to the comparison between the Philippine bureaucratic organization and the Chinese civil government or government structure. So the Philippines, quote unquote, similar with other democratic, not just democratic countries, similar with other governments, uh, uh, they they brag themselves, that is the appropriate term, no, brag, they brag themselves to practice their institutions to be democratic. So there are a lot of principles, features of a democratic country, and one aspect would now be pluralism. This is what I am discussing a while ago, or stating a while ago. So pluralism is a condition or system in which two or more states, groups, principal, sources of authority coexist. So for instance, example of a group would now be political parties. So there's diversity when it comes to ideologies, in terms of principles, in terms of interest or agenda, they coexist. And more likely, pluralism is an arena wherein different groups would now lay in their agenda in a diplomatic manner. So it's not in terms of war, but through debates. Another definition when it comes to pluralism is that power is dispersed among a variety of economic and ideological pressure groups and is not or should not be held by a single elite or group of elites. Now, majority of your countries who call themselves as democrats, democracy, or they call themselves, or they stated that they practice democracy, they employ pluralism. So in the Philippines, we have a multi-party system. In the United States, we have a two-party system. Regardless to say, they employ pluralism. So it's like this in the Philippines. In terms of the political process, uh, elections, and as well in policy making, so our laws, the constitution, and for instance, omnibus collection election code, together with the multi-party list law, would now encourage political parties who represent certain ideas or interest groups to enjoin the political process of elections. So this is in terms of who will get the political positions within the government. So through elections, there will be competitions, and those who will be elected, probably only a few, will now partake in the government process of formulating laws and policies. So this is the political arena, or the pluralistic arena. In the sense, they practice pluralism. So among the discussion, I forgot to include the diagram. So we have certain political parties who will now lay in their agendas, their interests, or for instance, a proposal of a certain bill or a policy. Now, there will be definitely clashes. So there will be those who will be against it. There will be those who are in favor of it. So the political arena is like a pendulum. So it's like a seesaw. So the pendulum is a triangle form. It's the triangle in the middle, and the one who has the power in terms of, for instance, popularity, favorability, the pendulum will now go near to the side of the winning party. So that's a process of clash of ideas. That is through debate. That is through legislation. That is through debate. Yes, exactly. Now, within those debates, now the political party, not necessarily the political party, now the interest that has been in favor, it would now become laws. So that is the task of the political organ. This is the political organ. Now, once decided through the pluralistic arena, it would be carried out and administered by the bureaucracy. Again, this is a political process. So from the legislative, it goes now to your executive through the office of the president in the case of the Philippines. Now, the relationship between the legislative and the executive is political in nature as well. So probably the whole legislative agrees on something, they crafted the bill, then later it will be vetoed by the president. So again, that is again another feature of your political organ. Now, regardless to say, the bill or the policy has been enacted as well, approved by the president, it would now be carried out and administered by your bureaucracy. So this is an example of or rather the illustration of the government structure of the Philippines. So the yellow ones would now be the political organs of the government of the Philippines. So the legislative is um, has the Congress, which has the two houses. I forgot to include your House of Senate, then your House of Representative, your senators, then your congressmen. Then the executive is composed of your presidents and your president rather, and your vice president. So they are political in the sense that they are elected, yes, and they go through with or basically they are the main actors when it comes to your policy making process in the pluralistic arena. Now, the blue ones would now be the administrative organs. Now, your departments per se is the administrative organ. However, when we try to look into the nature of your departments on the top level, your secretaries are political in nature. So realistically speaking, they are political in nature in the sense they are being appointed by the president. That's one note. Then the second note is that they, according to the Philippine Constitution, they are the alter ego of the executive, of the president rather. Now, from your secretary, which is political in nature, the succeeding or the lower inferior positions from your USEC up to below would now be the administrative positions. Your USEC, your ASEC. Yes, they are appointed by the president, but they are not already confirmed by your confirmation on appointment, which is coming from your congressman. And usually, the term there is usually, USECs, ASECs, your regional directors, are they usually belong to the bureaucracy, to the departments. Yeah. So that is one thing. And also they enjoy tenuity. So there are some USECs who are they have been offered a secretary position. So advantage of it would be more power, yes, from supervisory control, etc., and salary grade. However, if they will from ASEC or USEC, if they are offered to become secretaries, they will lose now their benefit, which is in terms of tenuity. So those are the downsides. So these are the blue, the administrative organs. Judiciary, yes, they are appointed by the executive, but they practice what we call as judicial independence, closely related to political neutrality. Although those would be another insight for probably another video lectures. Then we have the Constitutional Commission. One aspect in democratic countries is that they practice the principle of checks and balances. So each branches are equal and separation of power. So principle of checks and balances and the separation of power. So these three branches, main branches of government, are independent with one another. They are equal, co-equal, and they have different responsibilities. Yeah, you know the responsibility of the legislative, which is to craft laws, executive to enforce and implement laws, judiciary to interpret the laws. Okay, then we have the constitutional commissions, which are also part of your administrative organ. So same with the United States and almost all countries, I assume. They have a very similar, but as well with special or different features as well. Now, what is unique and why I have chosen China to compare with the Philippines is that China's bureaucratic organization goes like this. They don't practice the separation of power. And since China is almost one of the few countries who practice a one-party system, this is so unique when we look into China's bureaucratic organization or structure. Okay, so unlike with the Philippines and the rest of and majority of the countries, the Chinese government, when we try to dissect the government of China, looking into its political and its administrative organ, the Chinese Communist Party is equated with the People's Republic of China. So this is the political party, wherein a while ago, we now check here that there's a diversity when it comes to political party. There's no monopoly. There's pluralism. There's diversity. Unlike in Chinese government, uh, the government has been ruled only by one party, monopolized, or the power has been monopolized by one party, and we all know that is the Chinese Communist Party. So this is the political organ. Now the party itself is the government. Remember that. So the People's Republic of China is the name of the government of China, which is being managed, organized, ruled, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And both of them will now determine the civil service of the People's Republic of China. Now it goes like this. So I have certain images. I'll be providing the links of the images. If I tend not to include the images, all copyright reserved to those who created these images. There are a lot of images, but they point out one thing, that the party is the government. So the party has a different structure. So the party is the highest level when it comes to the party, the political organ, is the Politburo Standing Committee. So they are composed of the most senior 7 members of the party. So the head of the party would now also lead the government. So they have corresponding positions. So one in the party, then one in the government. And they will head now one of the highest level of the government, or the bureaucracy in this case, will now be the National People's Congress. So among the National People's Congress, we have now the State Council. So this is quite similar with the EXICOM in your schools, or the Philippines, your executive committee, including the president, the vice president, but in this case, medyo hindi siya kasali, no? Okay, so the Politburo Standing Committee would now be members of the Politburo Standing Committee of the party are also the State Council. So the most senior 35 people in the government. So here we have 7. There are some members of the Politburo who are also members of the State Council. Yeah. So by the way, the National People's Congress is the legislative of the government of China. So it's like a parliamentary system in the sense that how do you call this one? That we have the Congress, then they will now appoint members of the executive. That is through your State Council. Now, one unique feature of the Communist Party, or the Chinese government rather, is they also have another organ, which is now your military commission. So this is so unique compared with other countries. In the Philippines, in the rest of the world, the military practices neutrality. So if you remember in our previous discussion on the bureaucracy, civil servants must maintain political neutrality. That has been embedded in our policy here in the Philippines as well. So political neutrality in the sense that no civil servants shall partake in partisan politics. So in terms of the military, they should remain neutral. So the aspect in neutrality is relevant in the Philippines in the sense that during elections, when the power has been transitioned, or may I rephrase my statement, or for instance, the president has changed because of the election, it must ensure that the military is loyal regardless on who is on the executive. So that is again professionalism. But in the case of China, military is political in nature because it is part of the party. May I share something? This is coming from Sir Lohico. The military is political in nature, yes. But when we look into our civil service and the mandates of military professionalism, military should not partake in partisan activities. So basically, to generalize it in the whole civil service, members of the civil service must be non-partisan. Yes, we have our political preferences, but to state it is something that is unprofessional and medyo magulo na, no? Okay, so that is the party again, that the military, for instance, is political in nature. And actually, this is now another separate organ in the government of China. Unlike in the Philippines, it is under departments. So for instance, the PNP is under DILG. What else? We have the People's Liberation Army. We are subordinate of the party and the state central military commission. Okay. So also we have the party members. Then this is another structure. So again, we could now check on the government on this side, the bureaucracy, and the political organ or the Communist Party of China. So we could now check that there is a separation, not separation, a category between judicial, legislative, and executive. So it states here the organs, or rather the agencies or institutions that may be classified as judicial, legislative, and executive. So from the executive, the General Secretary of the Communist Party is the Prime Minister and and the Premier or the President in this case. So we have Xi Jinping. Now, in this case, we have the legislative. The legislative will now be coming from their standing committee here in the government or simply the National People's Congress, which is this one. Okay. So we could now see an intersection between your bureaucracy and your party bureaucracy. So, for instance, in your party bureaucracy, the Politburo, the commissioner, for instance, of agriculture in the Communist Party would now be the minister of agriculture in your government. So it basically coincide with one another. So we have this one. So they practice democratic collectivism as well. So what is this one? So in terms of policy making, the Chinese government practice democratic collectivism, or rather, how do they practice this so-called democratic collectivism? They will now ask their county level, their community level about a certain policy. So they will ask now the standing the opinion of the community members. So in the Philippines, this is like the barangays. So party members will now consolidate it, go through the provincial level, then go to your national, then your central. Now what has been consolidated would now be enforced by the central government. And once it has been enforced, there should now be uh, comments coming from below because that has been consolidated by the bottom level. So that is democratic collectivism. So we also have the levels. When we try to check, this is one critic against the Chinese government, is that there is no judicial independence. So when we try to check, the Supreme People's Court is being supervised and appointed, the members are being appointed by your National People's Congress and directly being influenced by the standing committee. So these are now the top level heads like that. So that is now your Chinese government structure. So I also have the party hierarchy, then the government hierarchy. So you could now check the similarities within these different images illustration comparing, rather presenting the Chinese government. So this is now the another image, Central Committee, State Council. So here are some of my reference. So thank you guys for listening.